mean, I lived in the Boston area for 26 years now.
Wow. I just moved in 6 years back.
Oh, cool. From Chicago?
No, from India.
Okay, okay. Which parts in India?
I'm from Uttar Pradesh.
Okay,
Originally.
okay. It is.
How about you?
Bangalore. Came to school and I never left Boston.
Yeah, I'm still figuring out the educational landscape here. My son is now in high school.
Okay. Where do you live?
Hopkins.
Good. Yeah. There's Shrewsbury and Hopkins. That's all kind of stuff.
How about you?
Wellesley.
Are you a CTO or
Same
CPO?
line, if you will.
I am the president.
Oh, okay. This
I
says
usually just leave it out. I usually just go with co-founder because it's like, I guess I'm the head of product, head of machine learning.
okay.
So
Just wanted to make sure you
we
were.
do our taxes,
Yeah.
Do you attend any of the other sessions?
stuff like that.
Hello. Thank you everyone once again for joining us today at the 9th Annual Startup Boston Week. I am Harish and I'm going to continue being your host for the day. Our mission with this conference is simple. It is to bring together the entire startup community across every industry, department, and funding stage. Startup Boston exists to connect, educate, and celebrate this ecosystem while serving as a trusted, unbiased guide to the best resources that can help you scale your startup. Before we dive in, I want to give a huge thank you to Suffolk University for hosting us. Suffolk has generously partnered with us for the last 3 years, and they have provided this space in kind because of their deep commitment towards supporting Boston's startup community. So if you're interested in exploring entrepreneurship with them, they offer a variety of programs and opportunities. So be sure to stop by their table in the vendor hall right outside, and you can find how they can support your journey and how you might also get involved with Suffolk's aspiring entrepreneurial students as well. So thank you so much once again for attending this event today. And now on to the session. I'll pass it on to the moderator.
Thank you everyone for being here. Very excited to be moderating this panel today, all about LLMOps, about AI engineering in business. My name is Nena Ndukwe. I am Developer Relations Lead at Kodo. It's an agentic coding platform. And we have 3 incredible men here today that you're going to be learning from, we're going to be hearing from, and I'm very excited to hear their answers to the questions that we have. So starting from here, this is Kevin Walsh, co-founder of Melody, how do you say it?
Melody, like harmony.
And I'm sure you're going to get into what that is all about. We have Shri on this end, CEO and co-founder of Quant University. And we have Lavnish, Senior Engineering Manager with decades of experience in industry. So very excited to get into this. So to tee off, golf joke, let's talk about just this overarching topic of the most cost-effective strategies for deploying and monitoring and scaling LLM-based applications in a startup with the constraints of a budget. Would love to know each and every one of y'all's experiences with that, and we can dive into that.
Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Shri, as I was introduced. I've lived in the Boston area for 26 years, 11 years at Northeastern University as a faculty, and 12 years as a founder of Quant University, and 1 year as a founder of another offset of Quant University called QCreate. And I'll talk a little more about QCreate and our experiences with LLMs and engineering associated with it. So my background has been primarily engineering and computer science, but I went into finance. I wrote papers on agent-based systems in 2002, and no one really thought that that was employment worthy, except for a company called Citigroup, which said, like, well, we may use you to build some trading agents and build rule-based agents. So we kind of built rule-based agents to trade various financial assets, and we were trading close to $30 million a day using agents. So agents are not new. So if you're thinking like agents just popped up in the last year or so, it's not new. It's been there for a while. It's just a question of how are you kind of leveraging LLMs and making it more dynamic, making it more reactive, leveraging all these design patterns which are out there. So we are leveraging all those innovations in our platform called QCreate, and I'll talk a little more about it as we speak more about the various aspects.
Thank you, everyone. I'm Lavneesh. Been in the industry for more than 2 decades now. I've had the unique opportunity to work with multinational companies, including largest asset manager based out of Boston area and one of the biggest as well. Currently working in the HCM industry as we are exploring how to use AI and LLM to make payroll industry better. Overall, I believe, agentic AI is the future, and definitely we are trying to explore them and trying to do most of it. I'll be bringing a more enterprise, vision for this discussion, while I'll be relying on my experts panel advice for the more technical side of it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, everybody. My name is Kevin Walsh. I am one of the co-founders at Melody. Melody is a platform for companies who are building AI agents. You can think of us like product analytics and user behavior analytics. Our customers are building customer support chatbots, or they're building internal sales assistants, and they track all of that activity in Melody, and we help them track the performance of those agents so that they can figure out how to improve it from a very user-centric view of the world. At Melody, I'm responsible for products for the machine learning group, among other things. I haven't had a haircut for a while. I saw that they were doing free headshots downstairs. I was going to maybe take them up on that. Before working at Melody, I worked at HubSpot for about 8 years, maybe 9 years. And while I was at HubSpot, I was the first product manager to work on machine learning. And I led that group from 2 people to about 65 people across product design, user research, modeling, all of those kinds of things. We launched lots and lots of machine learning projects, and at the very end of my time at HubSpot is when we started doing in-house language models. And so at Melody, I'm carrying forward a lot of my sort of personal experience of like being the person driving those AI initiatives for a lot of companies who are doing really their first AI projects, big and small. And excited to meet everybody, and happy to be here. Thanks for Harish and for everybody else for putting this on.
Awesome. A lot of diversity of experiences and skill sets here. And so I'm very excited to start it off with talking about, really want to know what are some of the most effective ways that you've seen early stage startups deploy and scale LLM-based applications, and keeping in mind keeping the costs under control. What are some effective ways that you've seen?
Yeah, so I can share my experience as a startup. One of the things we do is primarily focusing on building out pipelines. The goal is to make financial analysts 10x productive. So that's kind of the overarching goal, which means that the domain expertise which humans have need to be embodied in these systems, so that when we generate artifacts, when we generate anything using large language models, it needs to be giving us that productivity boost for humans, but also in such a way that it's reliable, it's auditable, it's tractable. So we call this whole area as what's called as context-aware engineering. So which means that to the entire life cycle, we want to embody this whole aspect of human involvement, but also making sure that the human context is embodied in this whole workflow. As you all know, large language models hallucinate. And if you just kind of give it like basic prompts, it's going to generate basic answers. If you create better prompts, it's going to give you better answers. If you create systems leveraging agents and tools and different aspects, it's going to be more and more robust. But as you add more and more layers, it means that there are more things that needs to be considered as you kind of build it out. I was actually having a discussion with another startup founder, and their major gap was the in-house technical expertise, because initially when they started, it was just an API call to a model, and they could just use a cookbook, and then they could just basically take an example, put their secret sauce in it, and say, okay, I have an example, I have something working, let's kind of take it to the business, right? So, and then when you go to a business and try to sell that solution, they start asking you more and more questions about like, well, how does it work for my data? How does it work for my use cases? So many a times startup founders think that when they have an iota of innovation, which they think is defensible and something which they can just incorporate as a product and they sell it, and the end users who really are signing the budgets are thinking of it as, this is just another layer over ChatGPT. Can I just build it on my own? Many a time startup founders get called, and many times they share their ideas and say, well, I can actually build it myself. Why do I need these guys to actually build the whole thing? So the one thing we have kind of taken as an approach is to, first of all, think about it like an onion, because we can't just build the entire thing at once. So we got to think about the core. What is the core we are building and how defensible it is? How can we kind of build the whole thing in one coherent form, we can bring in our unique insights and expertise, and then start building layers around it, depending on who the client is, what their specific needs are. So you kind of expand upon it. But if you don't have the core, and you're just thinking about integrations, because now if you look at the AI ecosystem, everybody offers an API key, everybody offers an layer to integrate. So many a times you just see these integration projects, which is this complex network of different calls you are making, trying to sell this whole architecture, and you show a beautiful architecture diagram, but the scaffolding is very weak. You don't really get to the core of what your innovation is. Many a times you're using so many other products, and then people are confused, like, what are you doing? Why are you involved? Why are you the person who are going to be innovating and building this whole thing? So I think that's where startup founders need to be thinking about, like, what is the core idea I'm uniquely building, which is defensible, which I can add value, and then think about how can I find my place in this whole ecosystem.
Thank you. I mean, from my experience, I would focus more, I would agree with the layered approach, definitely, and core would be the focus, but I would start small. I would focus on my minimal data set and the required output and make sure, as we discussed, like hallucination is the main problem. So I would start there, and then I'll start looking into scaling. Because with scaling, the problems would increase in terms of cost, in terms of efficiency, in terms of making sure that there's no wastage of resources, because with startup, the cost and the resources would be a major bottleneck that would definitely be something that we should be keeping track of from start. Feel free to add more to that.
I might just add that on sort of like a practical level, if it's like a stack choice that you're trying to make, it depends on the stage of your company. If you're like a proper sort of venture-backed startup, almost all of the major cloud providers have some version of startup credits that include access to one of the best-in-class machine learning models. So that could be Azure for the OpenAI stuff, AWS for Bedrock, Google has Gemini. And so getting your hands on free inference is sort of the starting place, and then trying to figure out how far you can stretch that. If you are more of a hobbyist project, there's also the state of free software is so good right now. There are so many great tools that you can use that I would recommend starting. One that comes to mind in the LLMOps space specifically, LangFuse. It's a great product. They offer a generous free tier. PostHog offers amazing free tiers. So those are probably the places to start. Eventually, you're going to run into, most likely, a compliance consideration where all of your vendors have to be SOC 2 certified. And if you have a handful of customer contracts and you want to be adding vendors to pass their data around, you may have to rope back in your customers' security teams. And so that may give you pause for deciding to add one of those free vendors. And that's kind of how, whether, for better or for worse, all roads tend to lead back to the big cloud providers, because they have so many tools that you can kind of like continue to add on top without having to sort of like poke the bear with your customer relationships. The last thing I might add is a lot of this stuff is actually being added more and more to like the core LLM providers themselves. So like the OpenAI dev tools and the Anthropic dev tools now include monitoring. They include basic tools for data labeling. They include infrastructure for sort of like one-click fine-tuning. All of those things can take you very, very far without having to go through the like rigmarole of setting up like what may seem like the cheap alternative of like a free model, but all of a sudden now you have to start dealing with like maintaining a training serving infrastructure and free, right? Time is very expensive, so just make sure that you don't get sort of thrown off the trail by that.
Those are all good points, kind of touching upon something that I took note of, open source versus proprietary trade-offs as you're scaling. You mentioned some things about security. I'm hoping we'll be able to get to that, but that's definitely setting the tone for getting more into the nuances of this. And so leading into the next question, something that I think is really important to talk about is this concept of non-negotiables. In those first few months of building an LLM product, what infrastructure or tooling costs do you think are actually non-negotiable at that phase? And what are some other things that maybe you can delay investment on, or maybe cut some corners? It's strange language, but I'll say delay investment on.
Yeah. So how many of you are engineers in the room? So many of you if you look at these terms called as verification versus validation, people who have done some systems engineering and, they look at like the various aspects. There is this notion of functional requirements and non-functional requirements, right? So think of a system. So a system, when you build a system to do certain things. So if you're building a calculator, so a calculator should be able to take numbers and add it up, subtract, divide, multiply. So those are the functions you expect in a calculator, right? So when you build a calculator, you're kind of providing those interfaces so that you can put in those numbers and you get back your answers, right? So that's a functional requirement. Now, what else should you be doing as you are building a calculator? If you're thinking about software product, you say, well, I need to be able to do some logging. I need to be able to do some traceability. I need to be able to, calculate all these backups and do all these other things. So those we consider what are called as non-functional requirements, because as an end user, you need the product to work first, but then there are other requirements which needs to be also factored in, right? So when this notion of verification versus validation comes in, you can do a lot of checkboxes saying that, have I done this LLMOps aspect? And I've done this other LLM aspect. I've done this security check. I've done this auditability check. I've done this explainability check. I've done this fairness check. I've done this hallucination check. Run these stress tests. You can do a lot of checkboxes, right? But the validation box is the most important piece. The validation box basically says, does this product work for the use case? Right? So many a time startup founders kind of focus on the verification side of things just to say that I've checked all the boxes, that it is compatible in here, I can do this, it's, it meets all these requirements, but the key part of does it actually work hasn't been fully answered yet. And guess what? Large language models are not like software products wherein there are deterministic outputs, wherein I know that 1 + 2 = 3. Because it hallucinates, there are so many layers you're building into it. So unless you have the core product clearly defined, all the other checkboxes become secondary. When you go into an enterprise, we are actually negotiating a contract with a large entity, and they threw a whole set of cybersecurity requirements we had to adhere to as we build out our system. And we are looking at each one of them. We are providing architecture diagrams. We are providing all our authentication use cases. We are providing all the things which we need to do for them to adopt our product, right? But then, even before that actually happened, they looked at whether our product actually worked. The product works for their particular use case. So only after they vetted out that the product actually worked, they are letting us go through the contracting phase wherein we are needing to add all these other layers. So it's always a good idea to think ahead and say, well, what all will be needed? But if you spend a lot of time trying to build the layers of the onions which are not the core, but do not focus on the major core, that's going to be a problem for you in the future. So when you build a team, what are you looking at? You're building a team with the core focus on what the product should be doing. And as Kevin was mentioning, you will go raise your pre-seed, seed, whatever it is, and then you will get like all this infrastructure and credits and all these APIs, and then you can start building additional layers. Now you have some money to kind of spend and add all these other layers. You can hire the respective people, consultants, SOC 2 certifications, and do all the stuff. But having that perspective that needs to be done, but focusing on the core idea is the thing. So the non-negotiable is like your product needs to work, right? So when you think about LLMs, that's the most important thing, because there are two aspects. One, you do not have control of the model. It's somewhere on the cloud. You don't even know what the model does. You just have access to a black box, which may or may not fulfill your particular use case. Secondly, you don't know whether you hitting an LLM and trying to give an answer to a healthcare provider, to a financial entity, to a legal entity actually makes their problems go away, right? So you as the intermediary need to do vetting on both ends. One is to make sure that the product you're building works with the LLM of choice, whatever you have. Secondly, you're addressing the problems your end users are having, right? Unless you're building a foundation model, then at that point you'll have a lot of money and I'd love to talk to you. Otherwise, you're kind of hitting API endpoints and figuring out things, right? So just focus on the core, because that's the non-negotiable. Ultimately, whatever other infrastructure or certifications you have, no one cares if your product doesn't work.
Yeah, totally agree. And stretching on that idea, like if we need to focus on core, I would emphasize on data. Data storage and accuracy of that would be really important for me. So, like I said earlier, starting small, making sure that the data set is getting you the required accuracy, as mentioned here, and then investing in data first, making sure that as I'm increasing my data volumes, I was in a project where we had to calculate around 25 years of daily stock data, and we had to publish daily models and monthly models and annual models. And we applied the same approach back then there. It was more of a rule-based system, but now we are talking more about agentic systems. And the core is same. Start small, invest in data, add layers like security, add more layers, making it more efficient, and then continue with your growth.
Broadly agree. I mean, the fundamentals of making sure the product is correct is like obviously like the most base level, non-negotiable. There's a trap with any AI or ML projects in terms of when normal software isn't doing what it's supposed to, it will throw like a generic error, the screen doesn't load, something will break. When machine learning systems aren't working correctly, they still like look like they are working, but they are just giving you like garbage predictions or garbage tokens or something like that. And so you can feel like you have been working on like something that is super important and it's very hard technically, but it may have fundamentally missed like the product shape. And so like if you fall into just be very, very mindful of that trap, because it can be, especially if you're coming from the engineering side, you want to like play to your strengths, and those strengths may be like setting up systems, taking advantage of all of this free stuff. And oftentimes the sort of like cheaper thing to do is buy your problem way more quickly so that you can prototype more quickly to get it in front of a real customer. That is like absolutely sort of the most fundamental. Maybe like a level up from that in terms of like assuming that you do have that piece of it down. The non-negotiable in terms of costs, I think, is like inference, is token generation. You probably don't want to be at this stage, I don't think, like standing up an open source model for fast prototyping. Maybe once you get past that very, very initial prototype, you might want to explore that. But getting access to free inference is like the non-negotiable thing that you're going to have to try to get around. Like monitoring, observability, front end, all of that, like very, very generous free tiers from like a lot of companies right now. So just like getting access to like state-of-the-art machine learning model, whatever that looks like, whether it's Gemini, Claude, or one of the OpenAI models, you got to figure out which one that is. And honestly, that might just mean like spending a few $100s, maybe $1,000 directly to one of the vendors and like moving on and like just accepting that cost.
So this is a build versus buy thing that we're kind of talking about here. So you're on the side of buy at a smaller, stage or earlier stage for a startup, if it's going to be easier to be able to build and move forward and scale.
For most things, yes. Buy, like outsource as much as you possibly can. I am firmly in that camp. And at a certain point when like cost really does start to become an issue, there's a huge range of ways that you can start to optimize, like whatever your system may be. And that may be like redefining tasks or breaking up complex tasks into narrower tasks where you can use cheaper off-the-shelf models before it gets into doing like the nuclear option is doing like an entire large language model truly from scratch, and like the compute on that alone can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. So like I don't think you're going to want to be in that camp, and so it's about finding that sweet spot. But in the spirit of like making sure the product shape is right, then like don't do rule number one of machine learning: don't do machine learning like as much as possible.
And do you all have perspective on build versus buy, I guess, in a more
I mean,
black
like
and white?
my simple rule of thumb is, as I talked when I look at the engineering lens, right, like the functional requirements and the non-functional requirements. I don't want to outsource my functional core capabilities. Anything which we do, which is our core, we want to build it because that's our IP. That's where we are going to add value for the company, right? Anything which is non-functional, anything which is required by others, but it's not core to my product capabilities, I'm glad to outsource it. Right? Anything security related, we don't do much security. Well, whoever has it, we're going to integrate it. You have specific logging requirements, you have observability requirements. We don't do much of that. We're going to outsource it. We're going to integrate whatever is the need of the hour. We want to keep it as decoupled as possible so that there is no vendor lock-in. So I can switch an API key and I could go to any other vendor as needed. But I don't want to build my core with a lot of vendor lock-in and a lot of integrations with other APIs, because now I'm stuck with their evolution roadmaps. And if something changes on their end, the dependency kind of comes to my product and I'm not going to be defending my product when others are going to be making decisions on the core of my product. So the simple rule of thumb I follow is like, if it's core, we build it. We take the cost, we just kind of build it out with the best possible we can do with our resources we have. But anything other than that, we can outsource it.
Sure. And my point of view, another factor for build versus buy is time to market. I mean, business is increasingly getting more competitive. And as we are evolving in this fast-paced world, like time to market is important in my mind. If, depending upon how fast this competition is changing in the field that you are, sometimes buying can be easier and, making sure that your company has the competitive edge. But definitely agree to Shri, what he said about building your core competencies while thinking about buy later.
Awesome. And I know that for those who have been in AI for a long time and those who are curious and been enthusiasts for some time, on the technical side of things, there's a lot of talk about RAG and vector databases and AI agents, and you mentioned context engineering, all of these things. And a lot of information out there, but I wanted to know from you all's perspective, what do you think is the biggest return on investments for some of these architectural components in your experience?
That's a very loaded question. It's a discussion for a couple of hours. Well, I mean, the technology always comes secondary for us. I mean, if it's something we can do with a single LLM call, we'll do it. If it requires us to have a RAG and then incorporate a RAG to basically get the context from a RAG, we'll do it. If it requires us to have multi-step process wherein an agentic architecture is required, we will do it. So I don't think the technology stacks themselves are kind of the biggest thing. For us, the biggest thing is the data, because a lot of data which these models have been trained on, the publicly available large language models, are curated from the internet, right? So it does not really have the private data aspect of it. It does not have the domain specificity, right? And that's the whole reason why you can't just ask an LLM a question and it gives you a correct answer. It's going to give you a very generic answer, whatever it found on the web. So that's why you need to do context engineering with a RAG to say that, hey, here's all my other secret stuff. Here are all my data points, and use this to build the context and use this to curate an answer for me. And the better I do with my RAG engineering, the better contexts I can extract and the better answers I can derive, right? And the same thing with respect to agents, wherein when we are kind of building out our agentic architecture, I can't ask an LLM to solve a partial differential equation, but I could set up an MCP server and connect it with a tool which actually can run MATLAB or something else which can do the partial differential equation for me. And as a mathematical model, at one point I need that thing, then I can call a tool, get that done for my specific need, right? But ultimately, it's about the data which you're going to be using to build out these contexts. And we work in probably some of the high-risk areas, if you will, the finance, the government, and healthcare, wherein there is absolutely the threshold for acceptance of an error is very, very low. And it also is so domain specific, and with all the HIPAA restrictions, with this, the federal restrictions, you won't find those data sets on publicly available databases. So the more you focus on data engineering, and the more you focus on enabling your customers to be able to securely load their data and access their data at the time of need, I think that's going to be the key idea. I mean, most of the times people spend very little time on the data engineering part because everybody wants to get to the fun part, right? How many of you will be hanging out at a salad bar when there's a dessert bar on the other side? Right? So the data is the salad bar, wherein you got to do the chopping, crunching, everything to actually get to the dessert bar. But people love to hang out in the dessert bar. They don't want to do the salad bar. They think it's somebody else's problem. I mean, I was talking to someone and they were like a whole entity, and they said, like, don't worry about the data. IT is going to take care of it. IT doesn't have any clue about the data. I mean, they have access to the data, but they don't know what's in those data sets. They don't know how to engineer the prompts. They don't know how to basically extract the information and curate the information and to even verify whether the contexts which are being generated are accurate or not. So many a times people ignore the data part. I mean, in fact, I'm teaching 2 graduate classes at Northeastern University, primarily focused on building data pipelines. And most students who take those courses already have taken AI courses, already have taken building models and doing LLMs and all the fun stuff. And then they realize, like, when they go and interview with companies, they're thrown a problem wherein they have absolutely no clue on how to address it. I mean, you go to a financial entity, they're going to say, all our research reports are on PDF files, and there are tables in here, there are page numbers, section goes from one page to another, there are images in here. I want to be able to like take all these things and leverage multimodal models to be able to extract all this information and answer these specific questions. And I want to do it over this temporal time series, which have 100 reports being generated in a particular time sequence. How do you solve the problem? It's like, I can integrate an LLM with an API key. So like, no, that's not the skill we want. Go back and like show me how to do it. And people come back and say, okay, I need to take a data engineering class because now I have to think about parsing PDF files, building the metadata, engineering all these aspects in these things. So unless you know how to do it properly in the upstream process, your downstream process are just going to be, fancy gadgets. I mean, it's going to be like a TikTok video. You're going to see like, that's pretty cool. You built like 20 pounds of muscle in like 2 days.
Right.
I saw this 3-second video. Let me follow the process. 6 years later, I won't still be able to achieve those results. Okay? That's exactly what's going to happen.
Sure. From my point of view, I mean, I would reiterate what Kevin said. Like, when we talk of RAG, there are 3 or 4 basic components in terms of what is the LLM model that you want to use, what's the vector database that you want to use. Most traditional databases now have a vector, I would say, layer over them now. Most of them have it. And there are many free libraries which offer cosine similarities like FAS from Facebook. So I would take all these free elements and try to stretch as much as possible, and then start looking into where I'm getting the most value out of the further investments that I want to make. Most of the cases, like Shri said, would be the data layer. If you have your data correct, if you have invested in your data engineering, you have the data pipeline, all the sanity checks are going through, you have all the automation pipelines, most likely you would get the best benefit of your returns.
Largely agree. I would just say to echo Lavishna's point exactly that like most PostgreSQL tables today have PG vector and PG search, and like you probably don't need like a fully dedicated like vector database. You probably do need to do RAG.
Why?
I mean, if you are just not providing any sort of additional sort of interface between like a language model is a reasoning capacity. And so if you're just letting your users talk directly to it and your product isn't helping to like enrich that conversation in some meaningful way, then like, why would you ever use that instead of ChatGPT? They probably wouldn't. Like, the retrieval step could be the user supplies additional documents or data, and that's fine. Your product can do that. That's maybe a place where like don't spend time, adding sort of like a smart retrieval step. If you can like have the product design get people to provide that context directly, that might be like a shortcut.
I have a question. I don't.
We have a question in the audience, sorry.
Oh,
So I had a follow-up along those lines. So say you've designed your product, you've added your RAG, you've done some, some structured, some unstructured data, maybe some large data models, a lot of fine-tuning, and now you want to switch the LLM that you're working on. How do you do that? Don't you need to retrain it and regenerate the RAG? Do you need to? Haven't you generated some vector database with the RAG? Do you need to retrain it on all the documents? Do you point the vector database with the new LLM? Like if you've done a lot of fine tuning and added stuff on top of it, like you just saying you swap the API key out for, or maybe an on-premise model or something, and it's that easy?
Yeah. I mean, I can give you some technical documentation, but so just to kind of keep the discussion simple, right? So what's a large language model? A large language model is a glorified engine which will take a question and give you an answer, right? So if I ask you a question, right, what's the best source for protein, right? You're going to give me an answer. But then I say like, well, what's the best source of protein if I'm a vegetarian? You're going to give me a more concise answer saying for a vegetarian, you can think about it. Well, what's the best source of protein if my budget is I cannot spend more than $3 a day? And then you're going to give me a different answer, right? So the more context I give you, your answers will be factoring in my context to give you back, to give a response, right? So RAG is basically a context generator. So RAG is kind of, based on the question you're asking, you're looking for context which will help supply the answer. So the large language model, today I'm asking you, well, if I find that, there is a dietitian in the room, so maybe I'll get a better answer with the dietitian. Maybe you are the dietitian, I don't know. I'm just making up stuff in here. So if I ask a dietitian, I may get a better answer. That's like switching the large language model, right? So I've asked you, but I can ask another LLM the same question and get back a response. So it's as simple as that for switching, right? But the key idea is like, in the back, back in the day, I don't know how many of you took exams wherein they were open book exams, right? Open book exams, you would take a textbook, go and answer, right? And then 3 hours, a lot of questions, and you had this big textbook. I would spend most of my time trying to search for answers because I hadn't read the book, right? That's exactly what happens if you design a RAG terribly. If you just throw stuff into the RAG is going to have all your data. And then when you ask a query, you're kind of searching through where do I get those pages which has the right information to answer the question. And many a times you'll end up in the wrong pages. And if you pull the wrong pages and you read the wrong pages and try to answer a question, if you give the LLM saying, hey, here are 2 pages, please use this to answer the question. If it's not the right context, it's going to give you a terrible answer, right? So the demarcation will kind of, become like, how are you engineering your RAG? How are you engineering those interfaces? The fine-tuning is a different thing. Fine-tuning is basically making your answer. So, it's like, think of it as, there's a customer service representative who has been working in a healthcare industry, now switched to the financial industry. Now they need to learn new terms. They need to learn new ways in which you need to interact with financial customers. So it's basically an adaptation process. The fine-tuning is an adaptation process wherein given more information, the LLM fine-tunes to answer kinds of questions, right? So that's a different thing. But yeah, that's kind of the major thing. You can switch. There is in fact something called as light LLM, which we use. Light LLM can basically act as a router. So you can basically put in a bunch of API keys and it'll basically, if you run out of credits on one, it'll kind of switch to the next one. So you can basically switch between LLMs pretty easily.
So, there's another person. I think we'll get back to answering questions in about 5 minutes, I think, or maybe 1, because it seems like the hands are going to keep going up. I just wanted to mention this because we've been talking about RAG. I think earlier this morning I was on the Void that is Tech Twitter, and I saw like senior engineers from startups that I will not name saying things like evals is useless or they fail. And there's other perspectives about how scaffolding frameworks for models are basically, or agnostic agentic frameworks are a lie, and that every model is so different, therefore system prompts and model diversity, it's so real that you need to have an entirely different approach with this model switch that he mentioned. So there seems to be different perspectives from people who are in the industry working in startups and wanted to know, where does that come from when someone says evals fail or they're useless? Or
I mean, I sort of agree with that, despite the fact that we sell an eval product at Melody. I think like evals are one of those things that can feel like a productive trap, where evaluations have to be about a specific task. You need use case specific, product specific evaluations. That means you need the truth about machine learning is it's still a ton of people behind the scenes that are labeling data, and you need data that's labeled for your specific use case. And if you don't have your own user labeled curated data set to be doing those evaluations against, the like off the shelf scores for like context groundedness or things like that, like they can be sort of directionally correct, but they are not like, it comes down to users, it comes down to product fit, it comes down to all of that. And so don't over-invest in evaluations. And even if you are doing the use case specific data curation, your product is probably going to be changing so much that those evaluation sets are going to become stale very, very quickly. So just be a little bit wary of putting too much weight in the rigor of your evaluation system early on, given that the product is changing so much. I do tend to agree that the models have different, sort of personalities, if you want, or, the way that you have to prompt the major model vendors is sufficiently different that if you do want to have the flexibility to switch between them, there are AI proxies like Light LLM, Braintrust makes one, Vercel makes one. There's a handful of them that try to do this sort of under the covers switching between the different model vendors for the specific data format. That said, I think that there are some benefits to just picking one and sticking with them for a year or maybe two. The major labs tend to have a pretty opinionated way of developing things, and they tend to be putting out new features to their product in a complementary way. And so I think that there are benefits to just sort of buying into one of the philosophies, and maybe that's because you just happen to already be on some cloud vendor and they have that one, or maybe you really do truly believe, but the mission statement behind Anthropic versus OpenAI or whatever that is, my 2 cents, we have done this at Melody, is just pick one and just sort of become familiar with that company's sort of approach and be very familiar with prompting those specific family of models. And I think that you will have a better sense of sort of what's feasible and how you can work with it, and it simplifies your infrastructure. So I think there's a lot to be said about that.
Does anyone else want to add to?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just going to say something generic because, when 3 years ago when OpenAI first started with their GPT model and you had an API key and you had one model you could go to and you could call it, and then there was oh, you could also ask Cloud, or you can go to Gemini, and maybe you would run the same query against 3 different engines, and you would say, okay, this one's better, let me use it. Right? Now, each one of these vendors have so many models. And if you go to Hugging Face, you're going to find, depending on the kind of model, a 350 million parameter model to a bunch of billion parameter models. So you have so many choices. You now don't focus on a model, you have a model garden. And you can pick and choose which models you want for which particular use cases, right? So when you look at some of the metrics and people go on leaderboards and they say, hey, our model is the best. Well, for what use case? Ultimately, your use case needs to determine, it's like asking which is the best car which is out there. You're not going to go and look at the rankings, say, I'm going to buy the first car which is listed by whoever, right? I mean, you're going to look at those rankings. Ultimately, you'll have specific needs. And based on your specific needs, you're going to make a choice. So many times when you think about a use case, sometimes we just need an LLM to consolidate a bunch of context and just give us back a response. I don't care if I'm going to be, choosing a Gemini model or an OpenAI model. I just need to basically take a bunch of concepts, structure it into, basic English and email it out to my customer. I don't care whether it's the best English or, it's just facts processed into a statement, right? In those use cases, I don't really care. But if there are cases wherein I'm going to be, having a very specific benchmark saying, I need to review all the last 10 quarterly reports of NVIDIA, look at particular ratios, consolidate them, come up with a hypothesis, see how growth has changed, and then make some kind of a deduction and give some kind of an indicator to a trader to make a specific trading decision, stakes are high. Right? At that point, I need to basically ensure that my model choice, whatever evaluation metrics I have, meets the specific purpose. So ultimately, it all goes back to the core. So the problem most of the times we see in the industry is everyone wants to be on the 17th floor and look at everything out there, right? No one wants to be there where they are and think about am I grounded at where I am? Everyone wants to take a big picture approach. So when you take a look at the graphs and the things which are on LinkedIn, things which gets published, your favorite vendor sends you a report saying whatever, you always get confused okay, so well, I should be switching my model because this is the next best model, right? So why, right? So you got to always think about your use cases first. And ultimately, your use cases will become the customer's use cases. And then can you convince your customer that you're doing the right job with formal metrics and the formal testing? They're not going to look at industry metrics. They're going to look at your metrics on how you are testing and evaluating your products. So you got to have the right strategy for your particular purposes. I mean, as a startup founder, one of the things I have kind of encountered over the last few years, I mean, I've been a startup founder for like 12 years, but my first company was primarily consulting oriented. So I would always focus on customer problems. But the last 2 or 3 years, I've been primarily learning a lot. And many a times it's sifting through the things which I don't want. Because many a times you will be focusing on the wrong problems if you're just kind of going with what's out there. So you got to always focus on like what's your truth, the grounded truth, and then focus on that, and then see what else makes sense from the industry perspective.
Yeah, I mean, more or less Kevin and Shri have covered. I would just reiterate the same from my perspective. I mean, putting it very simplistically, keeping an eye out there on, there are many comparison boards like Hugging Face on which LLM model is doing better in which area, providing the right context, and making sure that your code is built and your product is built for having an idea of all the context and is built to change. So those would be 3 key things that I would advise.
And it sounds like there's a few different themes here, and I want to make sure I don't miss some of them. I hear like a signal versus noise thing that you're kind of touching on it sounds like you basically explained how you handle that and focusing on the grounded truth. And then another thing was about data. Data keeps coming back up as a part of focusing on the core product and the talent that is needed. And I'm wanting to know about MLOps engineers and AI engineers and who are data engineers, who are like the people, this specialized team that you believe is the talent needed to build and scale?
All of them. I mean, depending on the size of the company, depending on the stage of the company and the stage of the product, right? I mean, at an early stage, you're not going to be hiring an MLOps engineer. You need someone who understands the data well, who understands the business problems well, who can understand how to integrate various products, and basically have a generalist who can kind of navigate the things. Because in a startup, you're going to be wearing multiple hats, right? So if you bring a cloud security specialist as your first engineer in a startup, unless it's a cloud security product you're building, you're not going to get very much leverage after this person, right? So you got to think about generic when you're at a very early stage. As you start progressing in your startup journey and you're adding more and more layers, you're focusing on specific verticals, then all those things become important. So if you're going to go into a company, secure data, and they need strategies of moving data to a cloud, having specific logging requirements, having specific automation requirements, templates which can be elastically scaled. You want the services to scale up, scale down, depending on the user growth. All those things would require you to kind of focus on the engineering aspect of it. I kind of in my course I think about like 3 things, right? So one is the design and development lifecycle. In the whole AI system lifecycle, there's the design and development, then there's the deployment lifecycle, and then there's the post-deployment lifecycle. So in the design and development, you're focusing on the product. You're kind of this is exactly rapid prototype, iterate, get it. How do I ship it? So that's my focus. Deployment is when the customer says, well, I need everything to be on-prem. I can only put these things in the cloud. I can only do these other things. I need you to be hosting everything for me. So depending on those things, I focus on the deployment. It has to be replicable. It has to be auditable. It needs to be scalable. There has to be the right backups. You need to be able to do canary testing. You need to be able to like switch between versions. You focus on all these aspects. Post-deployment is like, well, you're going to be collecting data. Like, you kind of, have a chatbot interaction. Every chatbot interaction ends with, I need to speak to an agent. All your investment is gone. I mean, you can't just say, okay, well, my system is in production. No, you have to take that feedback and feed it back to your engine and your developer saying, my chatbot isn't working. Every chatbot interaction ends with a request for a customer service representative. So how do I feed back this data? Right? Or if every time there is a authentication in a chatbot, you keep asking the same information again and again. So there's a bug. I got to like fix the bug. I can't like take the system down. How do I immediately fix it? deploy those hot fixes. So that's like the post-deployment lifecycle. And what are the various things customers are asking? And I don't have my chatbot supporting those questions. So in the next iteration cycle, how do I build those? So that's like my post-deployment lifecycle. So you got to focus on the whole engineering lifecycle as you kind of scale up your products. So the short of it is you need everybody, but at the right stage as you kind of progress through the career or rather the evolution of the company.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would more or less agree with that. Depending upon the stage and where you are in your journey, I would probably start first with an AI engineer and focusing on an MVP to get it out there to my first customer, get that feedback, be very close to what the customer has to say, probably look into more into data engineering side, hiring the right guys to make sure that my data is right, because AI is as good as your data. And once you are solving bigger data problems, then maybe you want your own LLM and maybe you want to focus on that area. So that's where I would start bringing in more LLMOps efficiency there.
You're going to need more than Claude. That's all I got.
Thank you for that. So now I'm cutting into the time that I'm supposed to hand it over to the audience to ask questions. I believe there was a gentleman in the back. But first, I just did want to say thank you to all three of you for answering all of these questions and sharing your knowledge and experience. And we're going to have a lot more of that with the back and forth of Q&A.
Thank you for having us.
Hi. Thank you very much for the talk. My name is Emmanuel, founder of Onye. We are a Plaid for healthcare. You mentioned, I think we all talked about the hallucination and everything of that nature. So sort of like brings to mind a drunken person that you ask a question and just like spit out ideas and stuff that isn't really aligned with the question that you asked in the first place. So there's some talks about how to reduce hallucination, implementation of the small language models. So what would you say are some of the methodologies that you've done or implemented on your end to reduce hallucination and false information?
Yeah. So I would disagree that an LLM is a drunk person kind of going with answers. I would think of an LLM as my know-it-all uncle. Okay. So my uncle has an opinion on everything, whether it's supported by facts or not. They have an answer for everything. They have an opinion on everything, right? It may or may not be right. Okay. So it's for me to vet out, but I have to be like cautious that it's my uncle. I can't just say, hey, no, kind of a thing. So you're going to be using the LLM, but the key idea for reducing hallucination is the core of what we do in our company, which is context-aware engineering, right? So the better you provide the context to an LLM, so you are providing that what is called as alignment to get to the answers you want. So if you need an LLM to be, and the example I was giving the gentleman earlier, wherein you ask a generic question, you get a generic answer. Right? Sometimes if you say something like, hey, create my PhD thesis, I'm going to give you, this is invoke my deep research in my $20 per month premium, ChatGPT and say, this is my PhD proposal, create my PhD thesis in 160 pages, and here's 45 minutes. It's going to create something for you, okay? It's not going to say no. It's going to create something for you. It's going to give you a bunch of citations, which may or may not exist. It may have some, argumentation, which may or may not be accurate, right? So if you provide the right kinds of context, I mean, like when I teach my courses, I use AI. I mean, I tell my students to use AI generously in their work, but also figure out like how they are strategically using it, because the jobs of the future are not going to be wherein AI and humans. It's going to be AI used by humans, right? So humans need to know better in how do you kind of ask the questions in the right way. So which means to say that if you can make it atomic, saying this is what I'm going to do, and this is the context and give me the answer, the chance of hallucination is going to be very low, right? But also you have to put in the things wherein you can use critique, right? There's a design pattern called as LLM as a judge. So you can create an answer and ask LLM to review the answer and say, hey, poke holes in my answer. This is an answer which was given, like poke holes in this, and it's going to give you a bunch of different things. And you can use it as a feedback to say, okay, go fix those loopholes, right? And there are various agentic patterns wherein you could say, hey, go search the internet for the best pizza in a 2-mile radius at 11 p.m., and it may give you 2 answers. And so, well, I don't like the pizza in the 2-mile radius. Go and search in the 4-mile radius. That's going to give you some more results. So when we do things iteratively, we got to let the agents also do things iteratively. So that's some of the ways wherein you can answer this one.
Just clarify my question. My question is not about the front end, which is answering the prompt engineering question. I'm asking about the back end.
I'm talking 100% about the back end. I'm not talking about the front end at all. It's all back end. Context engineering is all back end. Yeah.
Was there anyone else that wanted to answer that or add to?
Maybe like something that often gets left out of that conversation is like, well, we'll just have like show your work, like make sure you're including the sources on everything that the robot says, and therefore you can kind of like point back to that and like that makes sense. Making sure that you have trustworthy, reliable sort of like resources under that then becomes like the sort of real work and like the big time suck. So if all of your, if you have some knowledge base and like you're citing a knowledge base article that was written by a robot and like that, it's like turtles all the way down, just be like mindful that you have to like trust the context that you are using. And if you can do that broadly, you can like avoid most of, I think, the like sort of run of the mill hallucination problems that like were sort of rampant like 3 years ago. Just make sure you're including your work, but that in and of itself, like that's sort of the real work of AI.
So mind you, many of these sources which many of these LLMs use are things from the internet. And I don't know how many of you have looked for cures for anything you have had as symptoms on the internet. Every disease possible in the world has a cure on the internet, right? Without medication, with medication, by just having a subscription service, with just a trial offer, there is going to be something on the internet which is going to give you an answer for anything. If a large language model has basically sourced all this information and has thought that this is my knowledge base, right? For certain kinds of questions, you will be going with the wisdom of the crowds. And the wisdom of the crowds is probably going to be junk. And you will get junk answers. And you're going to say, hey, how can a smart engine kind of give me this as a recommendation? But that was because that was the discussion on Reddit, and that was the discussion on all these online forums, and that was the discussion promoted by all these online providers, and that was what was source for providing these answers. So that's where private data comes in, that's where context engineering comes in, wherein you are going to be putting, like, these are my reliable sources, go into specific data sources, go into Wikipedia, at least there is some amount of curation there. Trust these sources better than these other sources, and that's how you're going to engineer your answers.
So hopefully that answered your question, and we have 3 minutes left.
There's a question. Yes.
Hello. I have a question regarding benchmarks and like trying to compare, for example, an internal model that you're building out. I feel like right now with benchmarks being beat all over the place with the new LLMs coming out and stuff like that, I think industry-specific benchmarks are going to be more important, especially benchmarking those against the top elite human execution versus, the latest models. Can you guys talk a little bit about how we can build our own internal benchmarks to kind of build validity towards the LLM models we're building as well?
Yeah, absolutely. You need to create a curated data set specific for your use case. You very much should do that if you are going to go down the road of doing a proper eval. Be very take with a big grain of salt any sort of off-the-shelf training data set that can be used for evaluations for hallucination or anything else, because your specific context and data structure matter very, very much. And that's how there are tools to do that. You want to make sure that Melody is one of them. If anybody wants to come talk to me about that, you record all of the conversations that have been had and then go back through after the fact, and just somebody has to use their own eyeballs to manually read things and mark what is happening. Benchmarking can be you want to find on the build side of things, just be mindful of sort of not over engineering for marginal gains, Kaggle performances. It's always they're fighting over the tiniest percentage points of an improvement, but it's the complexity that they're adding to the system underneath that makes it so inflexible that it's actually overall more expensive. So just maybe that's one thing to look out for.
Yeah, I'm just going to throw in an analogy. I was in the market for buying new tires because my dealer said it's time for new tires for your car. So I thought I'm going to go do the engineering approach, go to the, I'm a BJ's member, so BJ's gives discounted tires. So go in there, put in my car specification, all these tires, like 17 different options, and then each one of them saying this is good for winter, this is good for thing, there's like so many other parameters, heat-related parameters, aspects about friction, warranty, life. So when you have so many facets, none of them are really relevant for me. My goal was like, well, I just need to replace the tires I already have. So I just picked up the number for my tire, replace that one tire, right? So you got to know your problem. So whatever you have out there is not going to solve your particular problem. So you got to know what your problem is, and you need to know what the solution for your problem is with whatever model. If a new model comes out, doesn't matter. I mean, if a new tire comes out, I won't just go and replace my tires. I will replace my tires only when I need to replace my tires. So you don't need to focus as a startup founder on all the things. Every day you're going to see something new, right? Unless you are NVIDIA and DeepSeek comes out and you got to fear, oh, what's going to happen to my infrastructure, you don't need to worry about everything. I mean, like if you have a challenge and a new model actually solves that particular problem, then go for it. Otherwise, you're not going to like say, hey, this one had a 2% improvement, I'm going to go and switch kind of a thing. So I would keep my eyes not too much on the benchmarks. Yeah.
Sure. I mean, I could simply add to that by saying that, follow the use cases which are most important to you. I mean, for your internal benchmarking, if you are into the CRM industry and you want to focus on those, so have your use cases ready and focus on those. You wouldn't be bothered if a new model out there can solve AMC 10 or AMC 12 or is a PhD level model. That's not what is most relevant to you. So focus on your use cases, have the internal benchmarking, and then use what's best for you. And also remember there is a cost to every change. So starting up, can you afford that cost? And what's the return of that cost? So those would be my focus areas.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you all for, that was super in-depth. I love that. And thank you.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Yeah, thank you. Nice meeting you. Absolutely.
Awesome. This was a great panel. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much. So we have a lot more in store today. There's a lot of side events happening, and there's the Massachusetts Climate Tech finale happening this evening in the first floor. Make sure you check that out as well. And Tree Circle Studio is our official photographer. You might have noticed we have a photographer taking pictures of you all around. So there's a QR code right outside, which you can scan and sign up for. We use facial recognition so that you can download your particular personalized album, having all the photos that you are tagged in. And thank you once again for being here. This was awesome. I'll see you again soon.
We got through it. Nice job.
Sri, pleasure to meet you.
That was lovely.